In a quiet suburban neighborhood, no one could have guessed that behind the doors of the Miller family home, jealousy was brewing, a jealousy so deep it would lead to murder. Jason and Kevin Miller were identical twins, but despite their shared looks, their lives couldn't have been more different. Jason was the successful one, admired by everyone, with a stable career and a bright future ahead. Kevin, on the other hand, felt trapped in his brother's shadow, always overlooked, always second best. For years, Kevin's resentment quietly grew, fed by his belief that Jason had stolen everything from him: success, love, and respect. But things took a dark turn when Rachel Adams, a close friend of both brothers, was found dead in her apartment. Jason had been dating her, and Kevin saw this as his chance to finally take everything Jason had by framing him for murder. Kevin thought he had the perfect plan. But as with all plans made out of desperation, things didn't go the way he expected. What started as a clever scheme to destroy his brother's life quickly spiraled out of control. Instead of Jason going to prison, it was Kevin's own actions that would lead to an unexpected and tragic end. This is the story of how one brother's jealousy led to a twisted plot and a deadly outcome that no one could have predicted. As we dive into the details, we'll uncover the shocking truth behind Kevin's plan, the investigation that followed, and the dark consequences of a scheme that went horribly wrong. Jason and Kevin Miller, born just minutes apart, had always been viewed as inseparable. As children, they were the quintessential pair of twins alike in looks and often mistaken for one another. But as they grew older, the differences between them became stark. Jason, the older of the two by mere minutes, seemed to flourish at everything he touched. His charm, intelligence, and natural confidence carried him through life with ease. Whether it was academics, sports, or social connections, Jason always seemed to excel without much effort. Kevin, on the other hand, was the quiet twin. While Jason moved through life like a star, Kevin often found himself in the shadows, struggling to carve out his own identity. He had the same potential as Jason, the same upbringing, and the same opportunities, but nothing seemed to fall into place for him the way it did for his brother. No matter how hard Kevin tried, he could never quite match Jason's effortless success. The more time passed, the more Kevin began to internalize his frustrations. Their parents adored them both, but often praised Jason more openly. Every time Jason succeeded, Kevin felt a pang of bitterness. He began to resent the constant comparisons, the way people would always see him as the other twin, the one who wasn't as successful, as outgoing, or as accomplished. It felt as though no matter what he did, he could never escape Jason's shadow. Kevin's resentment was compounded by his deep-rooted feelings for Rachel, Jason's girlfriend. Rachel was beautiful, smart, and kind, the kind of woman who drew people in with her warmth and charm. From the moment Kevin met her, he had been captivated. But it wasn't just admiration. Kevin had fallen in love with Rachel. The more he saw her with Jason, the more his jealousy deepened. Rachel and Jason had been together for 2 years, and they seemed perfect for each other. They were often the center of attention at social gatherings, effortlessly complementing one another. To Kevin, they were the embodiment of everything he lacked. It was as if Jason had not only taken the spotlight from him, but had also taken the one woman Kevin believed he could have loved. In private, Kevin would imagine what life would be like if things had been different. He fantasized about being the one Rachel loved, about having the life Jason had seemingly stolen from him. These thoughts started as harmless daydreams, but as the months passed, they turned darker. Kevin began to feel like his resentment toward Jason was justified, as if he had been wronged by fate. His fantasies shifted from what could have been to what he could do to change his situation. The turning point came when Kevin caught Rachel and Jason having a heated argument. It was a rare glimpse into the cracks in their seemingly perfect relationship. Jason had been working late, and Rachel was upset about the lack of time they were spending together. Watching from the sidelines, Kevin felt a surge of vindication. In that moment, his resentment turned into something much more dangerous. He didn't just want Rachel, he wanted to destroy Jason's life, to take everything from him the way he believed Jason had taken everything from him. Kevin's jealousy evolved into a plan. He began to see an opportunity to finally step out of his brother's shadow by framing Jason for a crime so horrific that no one would ever question Jason's guilt. Kevin convinced himself that if he could eliminate Rachel and make it look like Jason was responsible, he could reclaim his own life, free from the burden of living in his twin's shadow. It was a twisted solution, but to Kevin, it made perfect sense. Kevin's plan required careful planning and precision. He knew that if he made one mistake, everything would fall apart, and he would be caught. He spent weeks observing Jason, studying his every move. Jason was a creature of habit, which made it easy for Kevin to learn his routine. Jason worked at a marketing firm and often stayed late at the office. He had a gym schedule, a regular group of friends he hung out with on weekends, and a predictable relationship with Rachel. Kevin used this to his advantage. Kevin knew he had to gain Rachel's trust if his plan was to succeed. Despite his hidden feelings for her, Kevin played the part of the supportive brother. He acted as a friend to Rachel, always listening to her concerns about her relationship with Jason. He became her confidant, the one she could turn to when things between her and Jason got rough. Rachel had no idea that behind Kevin's friendly smile was a man harboring deep resentment and plotting her murder. As Kevin continued to build his relationship with Rachel, he began planting seeds of doubt in her mind about Jason. He subtly hinted that Jason wasn't as committed to their relationship as she believed, that he might be seeing someone else. Kevin knew that if he could create tension between them, it would make his plan more believable. The more Rachel questioned Jason's loyalty, the more isolated she became, and the easier it was for Kevin to manipulate her. In the meantime, Kevin began hacking into Jason's email and social media accounts. He sent a series of threatening messages to Rachel from Jason's email, making it look as though Jason was becoming increasingly unstable. The messages were subtle, at first vague hints that something was wrong, but they gradually escalated into more direct threats. Kevin wanted to create a narrative that would make Jason look like a man on the edge, someone who could snap at any moment. Kevin also began subtly provoking arguments between Jason and Rachel. He knew that if the police found evidence of tension between them, it would help build the case against Jason. Kevin played both sides, comforting Rachel while also feeding Jason's frustrations. He would encourage Jason to stand up for himself more in the relationship, knowing that it would lead to more arguments. Every fight, every tense moment, was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. As the day of the murder approached, Kevin's plan was nearly complete. He had left a trail of evidence that pointed directly to Jason, from the emails to the staged arguments to the text messages on Rachel's phone. Now all he had to do was execute the final step, killing Rachel and making it look like Jason had done it. On the night of the murder, Kevin lured Rachel to her apartment under the pretense of wanting to talk about Jason. He knew Rachel would come, trusting him as her friend and confidant. When Rachel arrived, she was surprised to see Kevin instead of Jason. She was even more surprised by the coldness in his eyes. Kevin had spent so much time building Rachel's trust that she never suspected he was capable of violence. They argued briefly, with Rachel expressing her frustrations about Jason and her confusion over his recent behavior. Kevin listened silently, knowing that the time had come to put his plan into action. In a swift, calculated move, Kevin attacked Rachel, silencing her forever. It was over quickly, but the weight of what he had done settled over him like a dark cloud. Kevin wasn't finished yet. After killing Rachel, he staged the scene to make it look like Jason had been the one to commit the crime. He wore Jason's clothes, leaving fingerprints on various objects in the apartment. He even staged a fake text conversation on Rachel's phone, making it look like they had been arguing in the moments leading up to her death. Kevin believed that when the police found the scene, they would have no reason to doubt Jason's guilt. Satisfied that he had covered his tracks, Kevin left the apartment and returned home, confident that his plan had worked. In his mind, he had finally succeeded in taking everything from Jason, the woman he loved, his reputation, and ultimately his freedom. All that was left to do was wait for the police to arrest Jason and watch as his brother's life fell apart. However, as Kevin would soon discover, even the most carefully laid plans have their flaws. In the immediate aftermath of Rachel's murder, Kevin felt a sinister sense of accomplishment. He had carefully orchestrated every detail, manipulating the evidence to make it look like Jason was responsible. It seemed like the perfect crime. Jason, completely unaware of his twin's plot, found himself at the center of a murder investigation that threatened to destroy his life. From the moment detectives arrived at the crime scene, the case against Jason seemed strong. There were text messages on Rachel's phone suggesting heated arguments with Jason in the days leading up to her death. The emails, sent from Jason's account, showed a pattern of escalating anger and threats. To the police, it appeared that Jason had been driven to murder by jealousy and rage. Jason was immediately brought in for questioning, and though he repeatedly claimed he had nothing to do with Rachel's death, the evidence against him seemed overwhelming. He couldn't explain the threatening messages, nor could he account for the timeline detectives presented him with. Jason's confusion and shock only made the investigators more suspicious. His alibi for the night of Rachel's murder was weak. He had been alone, working late at the office, and there were no witnesses to verify his story. As Jason's world began to unravel, Kevin watched from the sidelines, feeling both exhilarated and paranoid. On one hand, he was pleased with how perfectly his plan had played out. The police were focused on Jason, and it seemed like only a matter of time before his brother was charged with murder. But on the other hand, Kevin couldn't shake the nagging fear that something might go wrong. Despite the overwhelming evidence, small cracks in the case began to appear. As detectives continued to gather information, they noticed that some of the details didn't quite add up. The threatening messages from Jason's account seemed almost too deliberate, as if they had been written specifically to incriminate him. The timeline of the crime, while initially convincing, began to show inconsistencies. Witnesses reported seeing Jason leave his office late that night, but none had noticed anything out of the ordinary. Furthermore, there were no records of Jason's phone being near Rachel's apartment on the night of her murder, despite the messages sent from his account. These inconsistencies, while minor, caught the attention of lead detective Sarah Bennett. She had been in law enforcement for over a decade and had seen her fair share of domestic disputes turned violent. But something about this case didn't sit right with her. Jason's reaction during questioning seemed genuine. His confusion wasn't the type of feigned innocence she had seen from guilty suspects before. And then there was the matter of Jason's twin brother, Kevin. It was during a routine check on Jason's family background that Detective Bennett learned about Kevin. At first, the fact that Jason had a twin seemed like an interesting but ultimately irrelevant detail. However, when she dug deeper, she discovered that the relationship between the brothers wasn't as close as one might expect. Neighbors, friends, and family members described Kevin as the quieter, more introverted twin. Some even mentioned the years of tension between the two, with Kevin often feeling overshadowed by Jason's success. Bennett's curiosity was piqued, and she began looking into Kevin's whereabouts on the night of Rachel's murder. Initially, Kevin had provided a solid alibi. He had been at home, alone, watching a movie. But as Bennett began to pull at the threads of Kevin's story, more inconsistencies came to light. Kevin's alibi quickly unraveled. Surveillance footage from a nearby store showed Kevin leaving his apartment late in the evening, just a short time before Rachel was killed. While this alone wasn't enough to incriminate him, it contradicted his original statement that he had been home the entire night. Bennett began to suspect that Kevin might know more about the murder than he had let on. As the investigation intensified, detectives discovered that Kevin had been seen near Rachel's apartment on several occasions in the weeks leading up to her death. While this could have been dismissed as coincidence, after all, he was Jason's brother. There was something unsettling about the frequency of his visits. Neighbors recalled seeing Kevin around the apartment complex late at night, often when Rachel was home alone. This new information cast doubt on Kevin's innocence and raised questions about his role in the murder. But it wasn't just Kevin's physical presence that raised red flags. Digital forensics provided the most damning evidence. Investigators traced the threatening emails and text messages back to devices that had been used by both Jason and Kevin. While Kevin had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks, he hadn't accounted for the detailed metadata stored on digital devices. It became clear that the messages had been sent from a computer and phone that Kevin had access to, devices that were primarily used by Jason, but had been tampered with by his brother. The realization that Jason might have been framed was a turning point in the investigation. Detective Bennett and her team began to piece together the larger puzzle, focusing on the relationship between the brothers. Friends of the family came forward, describing Kevin's long-standing resentment toward Jason. One old friend revealed that Kevin had often spoken about his jealousy of Jason's success and his feelings for Rachel. He described Kevin as obsessed with his brother's life, always feeling like he was living in Jason's shadow. As the evidence against Kevin mounted, detectives began to consider the possibility that Kevin had not only murdered Rachel but had also orchestrated an elaborate plan to frame his twin brother for the crime. The more they dug into Kevin's past, the more they realized just how deep his resentment ran. With the investigation now focused on Kevin, the case against Jason began to fall apart. The pieces of the puzzle that had once pointed so clearly to Jason as the killer were now being re-examined in a new light. It became increasingly obvious that the evidence had been manipulated, planted to make Jason look guilty. And at the center of it all was Kevin, the brother who had spent years nurturing a growing hatred for the sibling who had always seemed to have it all. Kevin, who had once felt so confident in his plan, began to crumble under the weight of the investigation. Detectives discovered that not only had Kevin been near Rachel's apartment on the night of her murder, but he had also been in contact with her more frequently than anyone had realized. Phone records showed that Kevin had been texting Rachel regularly in the weeks leading up to her death, though the nature of those conversations remained unclear. The final nail in the coffin came when detectives uncovered the emails and messages Kevin had sent from Jason's accounts. Digital forensics had revealed that the messages had been carefully crafted to look like Jason was behind them, but Kevin had overlooked one crucial detail. The emails had been sent from an IP address linked to Kevin's apartment, not Jason's. This mistake, though small, was enough to blow the case wide open. When detectives confronted Kevin with the evidence, his calm and collected facade finally shattered. Under the pressure of interrogation, Kevin confessed to everything. But his confession wasn't one of remorse, it was filled with bitterness and anger. He blamed Jason for everything, claiming that his brother had always been the favorite, the one who got all the attention, the success, and the love of their parents and friends. In Kevin's mind, Jason had taken everything from him, and Rachel's murder was his twisted way of taking it all back. Kevin revealed the depth of his jealousy and resentment toward his twin. He admitted to having feelings for Rachel for years, even before she and Jason had started dating. Watching them together had been unbearable for him, and he had spent years nursing a grudge against Jason for stealing the woman he loved. When it became clear that Jason and Rachel were planning to get married, Kevin's jealousy turned into a burning desire for revenge. He had planned every detail of Rachel's murder, believing that if he framed Jason for the crime, he could not only destroy his brother's life, but also step into the spotlight for once. In Kevin's twisted mind, Jason's downfall would finally give him the recognition he deserved. But instead, his plan had fallen apart, and now he was facing the consequences of his actions. Jason, though devastated by Rachel's death and the betrayal of his own brother, was eventually cleared of all charges. The relief of being exonerated was tempered by the overwhelming grief he felt for Rachel and the shattering realization that his own twin had plotted to destroy him. The bond they had shared since birth had been irreparably broken, and Jason was left to pick up the pieces of his life, forever changed by the events that had unfolded. As the trial approached, Kevin showed little remorse for what he had done. His confession had been one of anger and blame, not guilt. He was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy, and the trial that followed was a media sensation. The story of identical twins, one a murderer, the other an innocent man framed for the crime, captivated the public. People were fascinated by the psychological complexity of the case, the dark undercurrent of jealousy that had driven Kevin to commit such a horrific act. In the end, Kevin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Miller family, once close-knit and inseparable, was left in ruins. Jason, though free from the accusations, would never be free from the emotional scars left by his brother's betrayal. He would carry the weight of those events with him for the rest of his life, haunted by the knowledge that his own flesh and blood had tried to destroy him. The story of the Miller twins serves as a chilling reminder of the destructive power of jealousy and the lengths some people will go to in order to tear down those they envy. What began as a sibling rivalry had spiraled into a dark, twisted plot, ending in tragedy and leaving a family forever scarred by the actions of one jealous brother. Kevin was arrested on a cold evening, surrounded by flashing police lights, as neighbors peered through their windows in disbelief. The boy they had seen grow up, so much like his brother, was now handcuffed and escorted into the back of a police car. News of the arrest spread quickly through the neighborhood, but the true shock came when the details of the case began to emerge. Not only had Kevin murdered Rachel in cold blood, but he had also meticulously framed his own twin brother Jason for the crime. The betrayal was unfathomable, and the media quickly dubbed the case the twin betrayal. The trial that followed became a media circus, attracting attention from all over the country. People were drawn to the sensational nature of the story identical twins, one of whom harbored such deep jealousy that he was willing to commit murder and betray his own flesh and blood. News outlets followed every detail, as the courtroom was packed with spectators eager to witness the outcome of this tragic family saga. Kevin's defense team attempted to paint a picture of a man driven to madness by years of emotional abuse and neglect. They argued that Jason had always been favored by their parents, their friends, and even Rachel, leaving Kevin in a state of deep psychological distress. According to them, Kevin's fragile mental state had pushed him to the breaking point, leading him to commit the murder out of desperation. The defense tried to gain sympathy by portraying Kevin as a victim of circumstance, trapped in his twin's shadow his entire life. But the jury wasn't swayed by these arguments. The evidence against Kevin was overwhelming. Forensic experts testified about the emails and text messages Kevin had sent from Jason's accounts, explaining how digital fingerprints traced the messages back to Kevin's devices. Witnesses came forward to describe Kevin's increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to Rachel's death, further cementing the image of a man consumed by jealousy. One of Kevin's former friends took the stand, recounting how Kevin had often spoken about his resentment toward Jason, claiming he would do anything to take what his brother had. Jason also testified, his voice shaking as he described the emotional toll of the investigation. He spoke about the confusion and betrayal he had felt when the police first accused him of Rachel's murder, and how he had struggled to understand why his own brother would set him up. Jason's testimony was raw and emotional, offering the jury a glimpse into the devastating impact Kevin's actions had on his life. The man who had once been his best friend, his twin, had tried to destroy him. The pain of that betrayal was evident in every word Jason spoke. As the trial drew to a close, Kevin's own confession sealed his fate. Despite his defense team's efforts to paint him as a victim, Kevin's chilling admission of guilt left the jury with little doubt about his true nature. He had planned every detail of the murder, believing he could outsmart everyone and walk away free while his brother took the fall. His arrogance and jealousy had blinded him to the reality of his situation, and now he was facing the consequences. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Kevin was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing brought some closure to the case, but it did little to heal the deep wounds left behind. The Miller family was left shattered. Jason, though cleared of any wrongdoing, struggled to move on from the trauma of being framed by his own brother. He had lost not only Rachel, the woman he loved, but also the person who had been a part of his life since birth. The bond between the twins was irrevocably broken. For Jason, the betrayal was harder to bear than anything else. He found it nearly impossible to reconcile the image of the brother he had grown up with and shared so many memories with the man who had coldly plotted to ruin his life. Jason sought therapy in the years following the trial, attempting to make sense of the senseless tragedy that had torn his life apart. The grief over Rachel's death weighed heavily on him, but the deeper pain came from the realization that Kevin had always harbored such resentment. The closeness they had once shared was now tainted by deceit and hatred, and no amount of time or reflection could undo the damage. Kevin, now in prison for the rest of his life, remained defiant. In interviews with psychologists and prison officials, he continued to place the blame on Jason, refusing to accept full responsibility for his actions. His jealousy, once a simmering undercurrent, had now fully consumed him, and the reality of his life sentence seemed to harden his bitterness even further. The Miller family's tragedy served as a chilling reminder of the destructive power of jealousy and resentment. What began as sibling rivalry spiraled into a murder plot that left lives destroyed and a family torn apart. Kevin's plan to frame his twin for murder hadn't just failed, it had backfired in the worst possible way. Instead of ruining Jason's life, it led to his own undoing. In the end, Kevin's obsession with revenge had cost him everything: his freedom, his family, and his future. The story of the Miller twins would be remembered for years to come as a cautionary tale about the dangers of envy and unchecked ambition. What started as a desire to outshine his brother turned into a web of lies, deceit, and murder, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake.